And I'd like to start with Secretary Albright. One issue that you and I have talked a lot over the last year is how, during the Holocaust, nations might have had the excuse that they didn't know what was going on. We know from history that might not have been completely right. I mean, people did know what was going on. But today, that can really no longer be an excuse. You have 24/7 news coverage, you have Twitter, you have satellite imagery. The excuse that we don't know what's going on in some of these places that I've mentioned cannot, seems to me, really be used again. And yet, we see again and again in some of the conflicts that I've cited, these atrocities continue to happen. I'd like to just ask you, why do you think that is, in a general sense? Because you've dealt with this both when you were secretary and now in your afterlife.
My afterlife.
You're after public service.
Let me say that I have felt very strongly about this point, especially the way that you frame it is that people could say we didn't know during the Holocaust. Most of us would not say that. But what has happened is that there is more and more information, and yet people do not quite know what to do about the information. I think, Nick, you have provided so much material on it, and people have a sense that we should be doing something about it, but they can't quite figure out what to do. And part of the reason, I think, is in speaking from an American perspective, is how we describe what is going on somewhere as being in our national interest. Why? One of the things, I was born in Czechoslovakia, and one of the real statements made by Neville Chamberlain after Munich was, why should we care about people in faraway places with unpronounceable names? And that is still the same kind of issue now. Why should we care about this? And part of it is trying to explain why American treasure and lives should be spent worrying about some place where people are killing each other for no good reason. So why is it in U.S. national interest? And I think that is a very hard part to explain. And in terms of national interest, you know if you're attacked that you have to do something, or if your allies are attacked, those are vital national interests. But why should we care? And I think that part of it has to do, I happen to believe, that it's in U.S. national interest to care about human rights and what is happening to people. I can explain it from the perspective of a human being, but I can also explain it just flat out strategic interest. These problems come home to America in some form or another. And one can argue the point that if terrible things are happening somewhere, that people then are recruited, can be recruited by people who hate us, and then it comes home to America. But the hard problem is explaining why we should care. I believe that Americans are the most generous people in the world with the shortest attention span. And the bottom line then is trying to figure out how you mobilize the various pieces of our governmental system and the multilateral system to have consistent action about what is happening, whether it's in Rwanda or the Democratic Republic of Congo or Sri Lanka or name it, because most people can't identify with it except for that first minute or reading Nick's columns when they really are very personalized, but then how to motivate some action, I think, is the real problem.
Nick, you've gone all around the world, put yourself in danger in some really serious war zones. So I'd like for you to give us a sense of how this conflict looks from the ground, and particularly, why does there always seem to be some kind of disconnect between these heart-rending situations of these families and individuals that you report on and the response from governments to really ameliorate that suffering?
Well, essentially, when I hear about some problem and I want to try to address it, then usually the simplest way to report on it is if there are refugees, then it's easier to cover that because they're outside the country. So in the case of Darfur, for example, you go to Chad, and the refugees have left, they're in Chad, you can interview them safely. If you quote them as saying that government soldiers have raped them, murdered their parents, then you're at much less risk of getting them in trouble for telling you that. The other way is to try to get a visa to go inside the country, which is you spend a lot of time trying to get that visa. In the case of Darfur, I managed to one time I mean, poor Bob Zellick, who was then Deputy Secretary of State, who I just tormented over this issue, he very graciously put my passport in a pile of U.S. government passports, people going to Sudan, and I was able to get a Sudanese visa. Another time, Kofi Annan was making a brief trip to Darfur, and I accompanied him, and I missed the plane out. I felt, I was sort of, I didn't know whether to tell him, but I felt I kind of owed it to him, and I said, I just want you to know that when you're, he was staying for a few hours in Niala, and that, I may not be able to catch the plane out. And he sort of looked and grimaced and said, that's okay, we'll go on. And sure enough, I mean, he was very gracious about letting me stay. And then you just, you get the help of local aid workers, local people in a camp, and in any way you can. In the case of Darfur, there were regular checkpoints all the way along, but I realized that the aid workers had all these passes to get through. But I realized that actually the Sudanese soldiers at the checkpoints couldn't really read English to read these passes. And so I took a lanyard and put my United Mileage Plus card on it. And that got me through this whole series of checkpoints to report in Darfur. It's amazing the respect for United Airlines.
But on the question of, so you report on these situations, and yet Darfur does not get resolved. Congo is an ongoing problem. I'd like to just press you a little bit on why do you think, from your perspective on these areas, do the United Nations unable to really ameliorate the suffering that you're reporting on?
Well, I mean, I think that very often there's an amelioration but not a solution, so that people will do something. But I think that typically in these problems there's no easy solution. And so, and there are a bunch of people offering different ideas that may or may not help, that are that require political will, political bandwidth. You're not really sure how much of a difference they're going to make. And so in the presence of all that uncertainty, it's always easier just to, if you don't really know what to do, then just wait one more day and that things get delayed. And what I as a journalist try to do, and I admit it's somewhat unfair, is to really personalize it and hold an individual's feet to the fire. And I did that with President Bush and tried to make him feel like Darfur was an albatross around his neck, and in the case of President Obama, I tried to do the same thing with both Sudan and with Syria. And so my headlines are designed to make him squirm when he picks up his New York Times, Obama's failure in Sudan, or this kind of thing. And I don't know to what extent that works, but I think that one thing we as journalists can do is kind of ratchet up the squirm factor for officials.